Hello and welcome back to the Cold Start Corner. I'm Eric Matei, and in today's episode, we are moving forward into the next section of your financial forecast and feasibility analysis, which is all about expense modeling. Now, you'll recall that the goal of the financial forecast and feasibility analysis is to answer all of the finance questions that you and your banker will have about your cold start. So in this episode, we are picking up where we left off last time in establishing these foundations for the cash flow projections. So whereas last time we were talking about revenue modeling across those 12 different variables at those 4 different time points, today we're looking at the other side of operations, which is the cost of doing business, your expense modeling. Now, expenses, similar to revenues, can be quite complex because you start looking at lists of expenses, and depending on how doctors are categorizing and itemizing their expenses, it can be quite a lengthy list. But it's not only complex because there's a lot of variables into it, but also realizing that these things change in real time, right? So one of these things we're going to talk about today is how your expense ratios will actually change as your business grows. Not only that, but these other variables of volume, fees, conversion rates that factor into all of these things that are going to ultimately kind of impact this cash flow forecast that we're looking to derive. So, what do you say we jump right into this world of expenses? Now, we could spend hours on end talking about operating expenses for a private optometry practice. But that being said, our goal here, again, is to simplify things, right? Because there's a lot to do here in this process. So as far as simplifying your expense modeling, it starts with categorizing everything into one of 7 categories. So first and foremost is going to be your cost of goods sold. And cost of goods sold is going to include, well, just as the term implies, anything and everything you're selling out of your practice. So this is anything out of your optical, contact lenses, over-the-counter nutraceuticals, perhaps a disposable that's being used with equipment you're doing in-office procedures with, any sort of implants, what have you. So everything there is going to fall into cost of goods sold. Now, as far as exactly how big this number will be, well, it's going to range. As a matter of fact, cost of goods sold at some practice sizes, maybe as little as, say, 24 or 25% of operating expenses. In other capacities, it may be pushing the envelope upwards of 30%. Again, this is going to range, but it's most important that you capture and consider cost of goods sold for your practice. Next up is going to be payroll. And specifically here, we are referring to your non-doctor payroll. So we'll include all of your full-time and part-time associates. We do not want to include doctor compensation in this number here. And similar to cost of goods sold, your payroll as a percentage of your operating expenses will vary widely as well, right? From a low point of, say, 18, 19% of your total cost of doing business to in some instances as much as 24 or 25%. So we touched on cost of goods sold, we touched on payroll. Next up is going to be your general overhead. So general overhead here, think of your utilities, any miscellaneous expenses, any sort of office supplies associated with operations of the practice. And your overhead, similar to payroll and cost of goods sold, you will find at different stages of your practice that overhead is going to be a kind of vary as far as what chunk of your operating expenses it is. And quite frankly, that number will range from a low side of, say, 3.5% or 4% to a high side upwards of 7%. Again, overhead, we're talking about your utilities and just kind of some of this day-to-day overhead to keep the business operable. So we touched on cost of goods sold, non-doctor payroll, your general overhead. Next up is going to be occupancy. And this is a really interesting topic, right? And it's an interesting topic because we can look at it from a couple of different angles. One is to consider, particularly in the context of your cold start, realizing that your occupancy expenses as a percent of your your total overhead is going to change radically in your first few years as you're growing. You're seeing that business really scale. The second reason why occupancy is such a fascinating topic here is because we do realize, and as a matter of fact, we work with many cold start doctors who we're starting in a wonderful lease that suits their vision, but we do have a goal to be able to purchase a piece of property for the office. So we're talking about occupancy. It goes from an expense to the business, and perhaps obviously will always be an expense to the optometry practice, but we realize that occupancy, if you own the real estate, can build wealth outside of the practice as well. But as such, note that your occupancy, similar to overhead expenses of these other categories, your occupancy is also going to range from a low end of perhaps 6% to a high end of up to 9 or perhaps even 10%. Mind you, this also is going to vary drastically in different markets across the country. So moving along, we've touched on cost of goods sold, we've touched on non-doctor payroll, we've touched on your general overhead and occupancy. Next up is your equipment. And this is a very fascinating topic, particularly now as we're seeing so much expansion of scope of care, really cool specialties that are arriving here. As such, your equipment expense will vary radically based on where exactly you are in practice life cycle. Also, to what degree are you adopting more progressive scope of care and what have you in your practice. So from an equipment standpoint, you're talking on a low end of say 2% of your total expenses to as much as upwards of 5% and some change. And again, that's going to vary based on the scope of care that you're deploying in your practice. Moving along, and certainly very, very important piece of the equation here is going to be your marketing expenses. And this too, as with everything we've touched on here, is not only very important to understand and to capture and monitor, but also is going to vary based on where your practice is in practice life cycle, and that expense ratio will change as your practice scales. And this number is quite fascinating, right? And it can really kind of dance all over the place from 1 to 3, perhaps in some cases even 4% of total operating expenses. That being the marketing piece. So moving along here, we touched on cost of goods sold. We've touched on your non-doctor payroll, your general overhead, your occupancy, equipment, marketing, and now interest. And this too will vary depending on where you are in practice life cycle, also to what degree you're financing various investments from the practice. So this will hover from perhaps a few tenths to a couple hundred basis points. So when you put all this together, you'll notice again, this whole world of expenses, and mind you, we have simplified this exercise. So as a matter of fact, we will invite you to take this and even dig a little bit further into what you believe your own situation may look like. But the key piece to take away is, for starters, that we do have these 7 expense categories that must be captured so that we can calculate your cash flow projections. They include cost of goods sold, non-doctor payroll, overhead, occupancy, equipment, marketing, and interest expense. But the second key piece to consider here is also the degree to which these things really are going to vary based on where you are in practice life cycle and what your business is going to look like as your practice scales. And as a matter of fact, when you net all of these numbers out, you come to realize then that profit margin for a private practice will range on a low end from say 28 or 29% to at times practices achieving upwards of a 40% profit margin. And a lot of that is dictated by how they're managing their expenses, in addition to how they're growing their top line sales. So your homework then here is to create your expense model and look at this at grand opening, at the end of year 1, at the end of year 2, and at the end of year 3. Because in the next episode, we're going to take that revenue modeling that was explored in the last episode and expense modeling that was explored today, and we're going to put all those together to establish your 3-year cash flow projections. If you got any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. Follow us across the socials, subscribe to the Akrinos YouTube channel, and find out everything you need to know about everything you're going to need to open your cold start in the cold start corner at Akrinos.com. Eric Matei signing off till next time. Have a great week.